hidden as a boy by her mother to survive the soldiers. A Lakota chief let her be a woman. The rifle was wrong. That was the first thing. I noticed it before I noticed anything else about the boy, the way he carried it, too careful, like he was afraid of it. The young men who come up in a camp learn a rifle the way they learn to walk, and after a while it becomes part of the arm, part of the shoulder, just another length of the body. This boy carried it slightly away from himself, 2 inches of air between the stock and his ribs, like he'd been told to carry it but never been shown why. We'd found 3 of them in the draw below the creek, 2 boys from a Sioux band and this one, smaller, quieter, trailing behind. Their horses were bad. One was lame. They'd been riding 3 days on almost no water, they said, and they were heading for a camp that no longer existed. I knew the camp. A patrol had come through it 6 weeks before and scattered it. There was nothing left at that location but fire rings and broken things. I told my second Hoka to bring them back with us. We had enough. We could feed them. The older 2 talked loud and ate fast and were grateful in a boisterous way that boys usually are. The small one barely spoke, ate slowly, watched everything. Those eyes moved like a hawk's still body, everything happening in the face. I marked it but said nothing. We had other things to think about. His name, he said, was Chask, the eldest son. I didn't ask whose eldest son. I want to tell this the right way, which means I have to go back further. My name is Sunkawitko, not the great one. There have been several of us who have carried names that sound like his. It's a common enough name among Lakota men who showed something in battle before the age of 20. I was 38 years old that autumn. I had been leading my band for 6 years, since my uncle died, and before that I had been leading in everything but name for 2 years before that while he was sick. My wife, Taniedu Win, had died in the spring. A cough that started in February and didn't stop. She was 33 years old. We had no living children. There had been 2. There are things a man does not put into words, and that is one of them. I say all of this because it matters to what happened with the one calling himself Chask. A man who has just buried his wife is not the same man he was before. He is quieter in a way that is not peace. He sees things differently. I think I would not have noticed what I noticed if I had not been who I was that fall, a man with nothing left that needed his protection, looking at a world he had started to hold at some distance. You see things clearly from a distance. That's both the gift and the wound of grief. The second thing I noticed was the sleeping. I had given the 3 of them a place near the edge of camp, where some of the younger men stayed. A loose arrangement of 3 small lodges set close together for warmth. The older 2 boys fell in with the other young men easily enough. Chask kept apart. He slept facing the wall of the lodge, fully dressed, and did not remove the vest he wore even in the heat of the day. I noticed this because my lodge was near enough that I could see the comings and goings, and I am a man who notices. It is what you do when you lead people. You watch. You watch the weather and you watch the horses and you watch the people, and you learn to tell the difference between someone who is private and someone who is hiding. The first kind turns away. The second kind is always watching to see if anyone is watching them. Chask was the second kind. He was useful, I'll say that. When work needed doing, he was the first up. He could tan hide, he could cook. He was quiet and clean and did not complain and never asked for anything. The women of the camp liked him in a careful way. They gave him slightly more food than he needed, which is what women do for people they feel some wordless sympathy toward. I noticed that too. I want to be clear. I am not a man who pries. What another person carries is their own. I have led people long enough to know that some truths are not yours to pull into the light. They belong to the person carrying them, and they come out in their own time or they don't. And either way you extend your protection over the person without demanding payment in disclosure. My uncle taught me that. He was a great man. So I watched and I waited and I said nothing. It was a cold morning in late October when it happened, and I want to say that what I did was calculated or patient or wise, but the truth is simpler than that. I came around the back of the horse pen before the camp was fully awake, and Chask was there, watering the horses from a bucket, and the morning was cold enough that he'd been working hard and he'd pulled the vest off and laid it over a fence rail, and he was standing there in the gray light in a lighter shirt, and the shirt was damp with effort, and what I saw beneath the cloth I was not mistaking. He heard me, turned around. We looked at each other for a moment that went longer than most moments do. I said without particular weight in my voice, "Pick up your vest, it's cold." That was all I said. I picked up a bucket myself and began watering the horses from the other side. We worked without speaking for a while. The horses moved and breathed. The sun came up a little further. She, and I will use the right word now in my own telling, even if I did not say it aloud then. She put the vest back on and laced it and kept working, and after a time she said, without looking at me, "Are you going to send me away?" I said, "Why would I send away someone who works and causes no trouble?" She said nothing for a while. Then, "Most men would." I said, "I am not most men," which was perhaps an arrogant thing to say. But it was true and she knew it, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. She said, "My mother cut my hair when I was 6 years old. The soldiers came through our camp and my mother cut my hair and bound my chest with a strip of elk hide and said I was her son, and that was the name I carried from that day. Chask, the eldest son. I had a brother, a real one. He didn't survive the winter we left that camp, so the name became mine and stayed mine." I finished with the bucket, set it down. She said, "I have been Chask for 17 years. I said, "What were you before?" She said a name I hadn't heard in a long time, a woman's name, a good one. I said, "That's a good name." She didn't say anything. Her shoulders did something I've only seen a few times in my life. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, just a kind of settling, like a post that's been under sideways pressure for years, and someone finally takes the load off it. Just a fraction of an inch of release, a body remembering that it can be a body. I picked up my bucket, I said, "Finish the horses, then come find me, we'll talk about what you need." What she needed was a lodge of her own, or a share of one that made sense. What she needed was women's clothes, which had to be done quietly. I spoke to an older woman named Wakawi, a widow who kept her own counsel, and Wakawi understood immediately the way older women often understand things before they're fully explained. What she needed was time, which is harder to give than clothes or a lodge because time requires that everyone around a person also slow down their judgment, and I had to do some of that work by example. Her Lakota name had been given to her by a Lakota father. Her mother was Lakota. Her father had been a mixed-blood trader who died when she was young. She understood the language well enough, but she had been carrying a Sioux name with a Sioux band who'd mostly forgotten her Lakota half. In our camp, that half could breathe. I am saying this as plainly as I can. I did not know when I made those arrangements that she would become anything to me beyond a person in my care. I am 61 years old now, and I can say that without any pretense. What I wanted was to do right by her. That was all. It came from the place in me that my uncle built. You shelter what needs sheltering. You use what you have to give what someone else needs. That is what it means to lead. The feelings came later. I am not going to rush to them. Let me tell you what she was like. She was 23 years old. She had a seriousness about her that most people, when they first met it, mistook for coldness. It wasn't cold. It was careful. She had learned from early childhood that the wrong expression on her face at the wrong moment could end her life, and so she had learned to keep her face neutral in the way that a man in a dangerous trade keeps his hands still. It looked like distance, but it was the opposite of distance. It was intense watchfulness, the kind you develop when you cannot afford to miss anything. She was funny. I don't know that anyone else saw this for a while, but I saw it early because she felt, I think, that I was the only person in the camp who couldn't use what she gave away against her. She had a dry way of saying things. She'd watch something happen and then say one word about it, very quietly, and the word would be so precisely right that I'd have to turn away so she didn't see me nearly laugh. I hadn't nearly laughed since before my wife died. I'm not saying that to put meaning into it. I'm saying it because it surprised me, and because it was real. She was capable in ways that went beyond what she'd been asked to do as Chask. She knew horses better than most men I'd led. She knew plants, not the women's knowledge of them, the healer's knowledge, but the ranger's knowledge, which ones were edible in winter, which ones kept insects off horses, which ones you could make a fire starter from in wet conditions. She'd learned that from necessity, not from being taught. She'd spent 17 years learning to be useful in the ways that kept her alive, and what was left when the survival pressure came off was a person of considerable particular intelligence. I spent a lot of time in those first weeks just watching her come into herself. It was like watching a horse that's been kept in a small pen finally let out into a field. Not a violent explosion of energy, nothing dramatic, just a gradual and dignified expansion into the available space. Wakawi, the older woman, was the one who helped her with everything practical, the clothing, the way a woman moves differently in a camp than a boy does, the social textures that had been invisible to her for 17 years. I stayed at a respectful distance from all of that. But sometimes I would see them together, Wakawi and her, sitting outside the lodge in the afternoon light, and Wakawi would say something, and she would listen with that full-body attention she gave everything. And I would feel, in my chest, something that I can only describe as the satisfaction of having done one right thing in a year that had not had many right things in it. Not everyone in the camp was easy about it. There were two men, not bad men, but the kind of men whose sense of order in the world is disrupted by anything that falls outside the categories they know. They talked. Not loudly, not to my face, but the way talk moves in a camp I heard it. There was one who made a comment in the direction of her lodge one night that I won't repeat. I want to be honest about what I did. I didn't do anything grand. I didn't call a council or make a speech. I went to the man the next morning and I said very quietly that what was in my camp was under my protection, same as everything else in my camp, same as his horses and his children and his food stores, and that I expected him to conduct himself accordingly. I said it in the way I say most things that need to stay said, without heat, without volume. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked at the ground and he nodded. That was the end of it. She heard about it somehow, Wakawi, probably, or one of the women. A few days later she found me checking a fence line and she said, without preamble, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "Most men wouldn't have." I said, "You told me that before." She said, "It's still true." I said, "Keep working. There's a lot to do before the cold comes." That was how we talked. There was never much ceremony to it. The cold came in the second week of November, and it came hard. There were 2 nights where the temperature dropped far enough that we lost a horse, and nearly lost an older man whose lodge had a gap in it nobody'd noticed until the wind turned. I was up for most of those 2 nights, moving between fires, checking on people, doing the 1,000 things that the cold creates a sudden demand for. On the second morning I came back to my lodge and sat down and realized I was completely spent in the way you get when you've been holding everything together by main force of will for 48 hours, and you stop long enough for your body to register the bill. I sat with my back against the lodge pole, and I did not move for a while. She came in without knocking. Nobody knocks. It isn't how it works, and she had food. Hot soup. Real soup with meat in it. She set it down in front of me, and she sat across from me, and she said nothing while I ate, which was exactly the right thing to do. I was too tired for conversation. I was too tired for anything except the soup and the warmth, and the small mercy of not having to be any particular thing for a few minutes. When I finished, she said, "You should sleep." I said, "There are still things." She said, "Hoka is handling the things." I asked him. I looked at her. She said, "You can't lead from the ground. Sleep." And I thought, She has been in this camp for 6 weeks and she already knows who to ask, and she already understands the arithmetic of what a leader needs even when the leader himself has stopped calculating it. I thought, that is not something you learn, that is something you are. I slept. When I woke it was nearly dark and she was still there, at the far side of the lodge, working on something with her hands, and the fire was kept up, and the lodge was warm. She looked up when I moved. I said, "You didn't have to stay." She said, "I know." I was careful for a long time after that. I want to be clear about what I mean. It wasn't that I didn't know what I felt. A man of 38 who has been married and has lost a wife is not confused about his own feelings. Confusion is for younger men. I knew. But she had just been handed back a life after 17 years of living somebody else's, and what she did not need was a man of any kind placing weight on her before she had found her own footing. She was 23 years old. I was 38. She had been in my camp less than 2 months. Any of those 3 facts alone would have been enough reason for care. So I was careful. I kept my distance in all the ways that mattered, and I let things be what they were, and I told myself that was the right thing, which it was. She was not confused. She is not and was not a person who confuses easily. She sees with the same clarity she sees with for everything, and she decided something I found out later in approximately the 3rd week she was with us, not because of anything I had said or done, but because of what she had watched. She had watched me move through the camp for 3 weeks. She had watched how I handled the men who talked, how I handled the cold snap, how I sat with the older man who'd almost died and stayed with him until he was fully warm, and then found 3 people to check on him through the following days. She had watched a thing I didn't know she was watching, which is the way I treat the people in my care when I think no one is looking. She made up her mind, and then she waited for me to make up mine, which is, she told me later, the most patient she has ever been in her life. I made up my mind in January. It was a cold night and the camp was quiet, and I had walked the perimeter the way I do every night before sleeping, and when I came back she was sitting outside her lodge in a blanket, watching the stars, because she does that sometimes. She says she spent 17 years sleeping where she was told and not always in a good spot for stars, and now that she has her own lodge and can arrange herself however she likes, she often does this, just sits in the cold and looks up for a while. I sat down near her. We looked at the stars. After a while I said, "I'd like to talk to you about something." She said, without looking away from the sky, "I know what you want to talk about." I said, "Then I'll say it simply. I'm not young and I'm not asking you to decide anything fast. But I would like your permission to court you properly, and I will understand fully if you say no or if you say not yet." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me and there was the hawk's attention turned fully on me, all of it, seeing everything, and she said, "I already said yes. 3 months ago. I've been waiting for you to catch up." I said, "That is somewhat humbling." She said, "You're a slow-moving man." I said, "I was being careful with you." She said, "I know you were. That's part of why I said yes 3 months ago." We married in the spring. Wakawi organized it with the help of the women who had come to know her through the winter. It was not elaborate. We didn't have the means for elaborate, and neither of us is the kind of person who wanted it. There was food and there was ceremony, and there was the thing at the end of ceremony where she stood next to me in front of the people who had become our people. And I want to tell you what that felt like. It felt like being known. Not celebrated, not praised, not even loved exactly, though it was that too. It felt like the specific relief of being known completely by someone who had chosen to watch you carefully and had seen what she saw and had decided, on the basis of what she saw, that she wanted to stand next to it. She wasn't standing next to what she hoped I was. She wasn't standing next to what she had decided to believe. She had watched me move through cold and hardship and small meannesses and difficult decisions and grief, and what she saw was apparently something worth standing next to, and she stood next to it. I was 38 years old, and I had been leading a band for 6 years, and I had buried a wife and 2 children, and I had spent a long time believing, not quite consciously, but in the deep, quiet way that a man believes things he doesn't say, that whatever was worth seeing in me had mostly been seen and noted, and was no longer the sort of thing that drew anyone in particular. She put that to rest. Not with words. The words came later in private, in the ordinary unromantic way that real things get said between 2 people who have learned to be direct with each other. What she put it to rest with was the standing, just the standing, right there, in front of everyone, like it was the obvious thing to do. There is more to tell. There is always more to tell in a life. But those are the years, and the years are not what I'm trying to give you. What I'm trying to give you is this. She is asleep inside right now, and there is a gray December light coming in. And outside the snow came last night, and everything is covered and quiet. And in a little while she will get up, and the lodge will start to warm, and she will say something dry and precise about the snow, or about me, or about both, and I will nearly laugh and have to turn away. I am 61 years old. I have led this band for 23 years. My hair is gray, and my knees know it when the cold settles, and there are mornings when I think about every decision I have ever made and wonder which ones were right. And then she wakes up. She wakes up and she looks at me the way she has always looked at me, with that hawk's attention, that full-body watchfulness that is not coldness and never was. And she sees me, all of it, the gray hair and the bad knees and the doubts and the years, and she is not disappointed by any of it. And that is, after everything, the thing I come back to. That she looked and she was not disappointed. A man can hold a long time on that. The snow is still falling. The fire needs another log. I'll let her sleep.